I now welcome Tellus to give evidence today. For the Hansard record, would you please state your name and the capacity in which you appear before the committee?
Yes, my name's Nate Smith. I'm Managing Director and CEO of Tellus Holdings.
Thank you. This hearing is a legal proceeding of the Parliament. The giving of false or misleading evidence is a serious matter and may be regarded as contempt of Parliament. The evidence given today will be recorded by Hansard and attracts parliamentary privilege. Before I invite you to make a brief opening statement, then we proceed to discussions. Would you please state if you're a current or former member of a political party or a union or an investor in the renewables or nuclear industries, please?
No to all of the above.
Excellent. I now invite you to make a brief opening statement before we head on to discussions.
Thank you, Chair. Tellus appreciates the opportunity to appear before the committee today. For too long in Australia, radioactive waste disposal has been in the too hard basket. It no longer needs to be because Australia has a solution. My name's Nate Smith and I'm the Managing Director and Chief Executive of Tellus, which owns and operates Sandy Ridge, Australia's first and only national facility for the disposal of low-level radioactive waste. It's situated on the Yilgarn Craton, a granite geological formation that's been stable for nearly 3 billion years and has been dry for around 100 million years. There are no underground aquifers. It's very remote and underpinned by a thick bed of kaolin clay, which is the zone in which we dispose of low-level radioactive waste, and it's underpinned by kilometers of granite, which is what's used in high-level geological, deep geological repositories. In other words, it's one of the safest places on the planet for the disposal of low-level radioactive waste. We achieved this Australian first by being transparent in our approach, without ignoring the wishes of nearby residents and without relying on laws or court cases which would force our facility upon an unwilling community. Building social license is the foundation of our approach and success. We negotiated a native title agreement with the local Marlin people. We've been through local, state, and federal environmental approvals, including 2 extensive public environmental reviews, which revealed very little community opposition to our business. In fact, our experience in the gold fields is that we have extensive support from the local community, which has allowed us to recently gain approval for a deep borehole demonstration project at this same site in Western Australia. Deep borehole is another prospective method for disposing of high-level waste, noting that our approval is only as a demonstration, not actual disposal of high-level. This approval for this deep borehole demonstration project is a first not only in Australia, but anywhere in the world. Our success in citing and obtaining social license for radioactive waste disposal sites isn't a one-off. In the Northern Territory, we also have an agreement from the local Titchikala Native Title community and support from the Northern Territory government to build a deep geological repository at a project called Chandler. This would be a facility up to 800 meters deep in a bedded salt deposit the size of a small city. It's approved by our traditional owners for both hazardous chemical and low-level radioactive waste. That means we've received traditional owner approval for 3 separate radioactive waste disposal projects in the last 10 years. This is unprecedented globally and a nod to Australia's strong culture of private sector innovation. I heard an Australian radioactive waste, or ARWA, representative at these hearings in October mentioned that they and government are canvassing international experience for radioactive waste disposal to inform government's approach on disposal. But I want to clarify for the record that we already have deep and leading international experience in radioactive waste disposal right here in Australia with Tellus, and we don't need to go offshore. In fact, our team at Australian-based Tellus has been sought out for our experience in low-level radioactive waste disposal by multiple nations across the world, including, very humbly, being asked to recently speak at the United States Department of Energy White House-led consent-based siting workshop, where we were the only international party invited. To underscore this, Tellus has the only management team globally, in the world, government or private, that's run a successful radioactive waste disposal project end-to-end. That includes siting, social license, community engagement, approvals, design, construction, and operation. That innovation is here for Australia's use and is a valuable way to de-risk AUKUS or, if we choose, other nuclear program delivery. Thanks to Tellus, low-level radioactive waste today is already being safely disposed in Australia. For example, in the last 18 months, Tellus has disposed of almost triple the amount of low-level radioactive waste in the Commonwealth's entire published inventory. And we've moved low-level radioactive waste from almost every state and territory for disposal. In our view, it's now government and government agencies hindering the safe disposal of radioactive waste that's currently stored in 100 sites all across Australia because we can't take it. Governments all over the world do not have a great record on waste disposal for radioactive material. Australia in particular has been operating a nuclear reactor at Lucas Heights since the 1950s, but has never found a permanent solution for the waste generated there. In 2021, ANSTO called out the need for a permanent waste solution, stating, quote, "Finding a long-term management solution for Australia's radioactive waste is a national responsibility and is of critical importance to ANSTO," unquote. RO was then established in 2020 with a mission to find a solution for Australia's low-level radioactive waste disposal. 4 years later, 12 years after government legislated a process to locate a site, and after its CEO and leadership team visited Sandy Ridge nearly 2 years ago, ARWA has advised this committee that a disposal facility is still decades away. Importantly for this committee, it is the low-level radioactive waste, not the high-level radioactive waste, that will be the year-to-year issue in our lifetimes as AUKUS subs as soon as 2027 and or future reactors go through standard annual maintenance. And I'm here to tell you that Australia already has the capability today to dispose of that at Sandy Ridge. The high-level waste or spent fuel, that's an issue that also must be addressed, but that's a solution that won't be needed for many decades. Still, for these higher grades of radioactive waste, Australia's geology is as good or better than any in the world for safe, permanent storage of radioactive and nuclear waste. If Australia decides to develop a nuclear power industry, we're well placed to be one of the only countries in the world, if not the only one, that develops a solution for nuclear waste before it's even generated. And to me, that would be an incredibly green outcome. That's because as well as our natural geological advantages, private companies like Tellus can work with government to help fast-track solutions that'll save time and taxpayer funds while leveraging our world-leading innovation to get facilities like this up and running. As a nation, we should recognize there's no need to start again from scratch. Lastly, before I take the committee's questions, and I think I've spoken to most of you in the past, I'd extend an open invitation for anyone in government or this group to visit Sandy Ridge at any time. We'd love to show you firsthand the incredible job we're doing cleaning up Australia of low-level radioactive and chemical wastes. As we always say to community, we don't have anything to hide, and in fact, we're extremely proud of what we've built. So after a bit of an introduction, I'm happy to take questions from the committee.
Thank you, Mr. Smith, and we'll start with Mr. Chester.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Mr. Smith, for your evidence. Now, in your submission, so first I want to make one point. One of the hesitations we hear as we've travelled around in this inquiry and in my lecture in Gippsland is the hesitation around nuclear energy regarding waste disposal, which you've just addressed in your opening comments. But in your submission you indicate, and I quote, "There are no technical or engineering barriers to the safe transport, storage and disposal of radioactive waste in Australia." How unhelpful is it, given your position that there are no technical engineering barriers, to see scare campaigns on this issue around waste?
Honestly, I'm a humble business person. I don't get involved in any of the scare campaigns or tactics. All I can say is that there is a method to shipping low-level radioactive waste, in particular state to state. Great example. Most recently, we accepted 6,000 tons of low-level radioactive waste from Sydney, Hunters Hill, in fact, working with the New South Wales state government. We shipped it through 3 different states using road and rail, and it's now been, or is on its way, it's already at site, and it's being safely disposed of. So I think from my perspective is there are standards and there are safety examples of ways to move this stuff, and I think important part of this committee and us as a business involved in this is to explain that this can be done safely, and frankly it's done safely all over the world.
So if it's not stored at your facility, where's it being stored at the moment?
Yeah, it would blow. A lot of people don't realize that Australia creates more hazardous waste per person than any country in the world. And there are hundreds of thousands of tons of low-level radioactive waste all over this country, from critical minerals and rare earths processing, uranium mining, defense, offshore oil and gas decommissioning, nuclear medicine, as I'm sure a lot of people talked about, even smoke detectors and water filtration and treatment. Right now, before Tellus opened, there was never a solution to permanently dispose of low-level radioactive waste, despite being, the demand and guidelines of not only the IAEA but also past governments. So right now it's stored in hospitals, basements, on site at Lucas Heights, and other places all around Australia, which is really quite unfortunate.
Thank you. And a final question, Chair. You indicate also that Australia's geology is ideal for safe hazardous waste management. And further to your evidence, you indicate that wind and hydropower create challenges with hazardous soils and wind turbine blades. There's no current sustainable solution for the safe management of end-of-life solar panels which contain heavy metals, they're difficult to isolate, uncommercial recycle, and by law cannot be disposed of in conventional landfills. The point I'm getting to, and the question relates to, all forms of energy generation result in a waste problem that needs to be resolved safely in partnership with the community. Can you expand on your thoughts there about how we educate the community that the whole of life challenge of energy generation of this scale results in a waste issue? We have to manage somehow, whether it's nuclear, oil and gas, solar, wind. Is that a fair description?
You're quite right, and I know I have the Conservation Council behind me, so I want to be clear about this because we talked about this for years, right? There is not a power source that exists in the world that doesn't create massive amounts of low-level radioactive or chemical wastes. Everything, okay? Solar, lead and cadmium in the panels, not to mention the toxic acids in the polysilicon. Only around 90%, around 90% of current panels go to landfill. It's a real challenge and they're hazardous. Talk about the hazardous oils and also the challenges of the blades when it comes to hydro and also wind. And then I think one of the biggest challenges is the hundreds of thousands of tons of low-level radioactive material that's created from rare earths productions for our Tesla car batteries. Nuclear is no different. There is a waste product that is generated. It's just different in scale. The nuclear actually is a smaller amount, but it's higher, obviously, in radioactivity. So, look, we always say that we are agnostic to the energy mix, but what we are here to say from Tellus is that regardless of the source that the Australian voters and government decide to choose for the energy mix, we can safely store and dispose of nearly any waste that will come out of this energy transition today at Tellus for the next 3 to 4 decades.
Thanks, Chair.
Ms. Mascarenas.
I recognise that hazardous waste is a challenge across, I'm going to say, all industries. From a nuclear power generation perspective, do you have a sense of the scale of the waste that would be produced for 14 gigawatts of nuclear energy?
So I do not in specific. I think what we've talked about, particularly as we've helped consult around the world on different disposal sites, which we've done, I think, on 4 or 5 different continents now, is a lot of it depends, as you would understand, on the technology deployed. So my understanding is, remember, the key issue for both AUKUS reactors, SMRs, or large reactors, regardless of the type, it's the year to year for the next 30 years of the low-level radioactive waste. That we can take in whatever scale. However, I imagine what you're talking about is the high-level waste. My understanding is from an SMR at the end of life, it's somewhere around the size of a bathtub. For something that's a large-scale reactor, it's somewhere around the size of a house. And that's generally when we talk to community, particularly abroad, because here, obviously, nuclear is not allowed. Those are the figures that we talked about. But it can obviously vary quite a bit depending on the technology.
My next question is around social license, and it sounds like you guys have done a lot of work to earn your social license to do the work that you're doing.
Thanks a lot to your hometown community, to be honest.
I'm glad you know I'm from the Goldfields. The thing that I'm wondering is whether you think that social license can be earned, particularly in a West Australian context, for nuclear power generation.
I think that the reason why we've been successful, and again, I can only talk about low-level radioactive waste because that's the only area where we have done community engagement. All I can say is what I'd put on record. It all has to start with trust. You know, the fact of the matter, and I think, you know, Honorable Darren Chester mentioned that we do have the technical capability, right? Australia has the geology, And frankly, there's technology out there to dispose of high-level waste. The challenge is, to your point, it's the social license. And I think one of the things that we see in particular with AUKUS as an example is going down the same mistakes we've made in the past at government, going out and announcing things at Osborne and Sterling without first doing the community engagement, or for example, getting the traditional owners on board. And I think that's where we've been successful, is we've started with building trust first, because once you build trust with your community and your stakeholders and your traditional owners, then that's what allows you to do what we've done, which is actually build facilities to put the stuff where it needs to be disposed permanently underground.
This will be my final question, which is, before in the hearings I talked about mine lives, and one of the things I can't get my head around is the nuclear waste life and what the business model looks like for that. And so can you explain what the business model is from a high level perspective of being able to store nuclear waste for tens of thousands of years?
So again, I have to separate this into two, and if you'll just give me a moment. So we are one of only 3 private companies in the world that have approval to dispose of low-level radioactive waste. The other 2 are in the United States, and that's actually who the U.S. government defense uses to dispose of their low-level radioactive waste, Energy Solutions and WCS. What we have done here at Tellus is, because we didn't want to be like a mine where when we closed up, there was a chance that the liability fell back onto government. So what we did is we actually created, and this is part of our intellectual property, this unique trust structure that grows throughout time, almost like a superannuation fund. The sole beneficiary is the WA government, and it's audited every 3 years. And there has to be enough money in there that if we ever fell over or we ever closed, for the WA government to be able to step in, and there has to be enough cash in there to monitor the site for 100 years post-closure. Now, this gets to your question. The 100 years is what's called the institutional control period, and that is based on what the half-life is or how the radionuclides we take break down. So that is possible for a private company to take low-level waste. The reason why there is no private company taking high-level waste is that really has to have government backing. The reason why it has to have government backing is because, to your point, there has to be an entity that guarantees there will be funding for thousands of years. And again, if you're talking about taking high-level waste in, for example, 50 years at the end of an AUKUS sub, a private company obviously can't wait around for 50 years for revenue. So that's why it typically falls to government when it comes to high-level wastes, as far as owning and operating high-level waste facilities.
Thank you.
Thank you, Deputy Chair.
Thank you, Chair. Thanks very much for appearing before us today, and by the sounds of it, we should also be saying congratulations to you.
Thank you, sir.
By the sounds of it, you've got a facility which is world class and recognised as such. So just talking about ANSTO, so to be clear, does your facility already take material from ANSTO?
So right now, government policy is to essentially build a competing low-level radioactive waste facility. That's the current policy under government is for ARWA to go out and spend billions of tax dollars and decades to build a facility just like Sandy Ridge, although we have already disposed of, just in the last 18 months, more than triple the amount of current Commonwealth inventory at ANSTO. So no, we have not taken any waste from ANSTO because government policy has prevented it. However, from a regulatory, technical perspective, transport, we're more than able to do it.
So if you looked at the material that would otherwise go to the likes of a Kimber site, how much of that would Sandy Ridge be able to take?
So from a technical perspective, we could take all of it, and we could potentially store the ILW. So the idea of Kimbo was to dispose of low-level radioactive waste, all of the Commonwealth's inventory, and to store the intermediate waste until a high-level or intermediate site was found. Sandy Ridge could do that were it not for the WA Prohibition Act, which prevents moving intermediate or high-level waste into Western Australia. That said, our current waste acceptance criteria, which is what's been issued by our regulator at WA Rad Health, we have only requested approval for certain radionuclides or certain types of waste. And the reason why we've done that is because we haven't sought to take all of ANSTO's inventory because it wasn't worth our time. Because the only type of waste that basically raises to that level is government waste, which we've been told we're not allowed to take under current government policy. So if I could summarize that, because it's a little bit long-winded, technically, Sandy Ridge could take the entire Commonwealth's low-level radioactive waste inventory, no issues. It would just require some slight changes to our license working with the regulator.
Interesting. So I know we've already spoken about social license and so forth, but I'm wondering if you just expand on it, because we've heard from some people, including today, that it would be very difficult. Others have suggested nigh impossible to get agreement from communities about the storage of waste, while it's currently, for the AUKUS program, the responsibility of the Albanese government, and they've signed up for that. AUKUS is nonetheless a bipartisan pursuit. And so regardless of political stripe, there's a need there for a solution to be found. So, of course, the permanent storage of high-level nuclear waste, it probably has a higher bar, maybe, than a nuclear power plant, which might last 80 years up to 100 years with the waste stored on site. But nonetheless, challenging still. Listening to your story, well, you guys have cracked the nut somewhat. So can you just expand a little bit more about the various steps and you talk about the word trust, which is what I've also heard internationally from the nuclear industry. What does it actually mean? What does it mean in terms of the steps taken, so that we're clear about that as a coalition, given our plans for community consultation and engagement?
It's a good question, and I hope this doesn't seem like I'm dodging the question, but it's more art than science in a lot of ways. The way that Tellus started with it, though, was almost as a disruptor attitude. So we looked abroad. The only entities that had ever, outside of two small ones in the United States, that had tried to site a radioactive waste facility had all been governments, right? So we went through, one of the first things our management team did was we looked through and what did they do wrong? And one of the biggest things that we saw is they announced and then did consultation. Again, we wanted to go back and bring people on the journey first and give them effective veto rights before moving forward. And I'll give a few examples. But as part of that, one of the things we've done, and this is why we've been asked to go to several countries around the world, again, on I think 4 different continents now, we've been requested to come give our process for siting. We have somewhere around, and it's growing, but at that time, was 72 different site selection criteria, where as opposed to just focusing on geology, we really focused on socioeconomics. We focused on, and again, somebody from the goldfields would understand, focusing on communities that understand that waste and challenging waste moves every day, right? We focused on communities that had strong governance principles. Particularly in Australia, you want to make sure that you have traditional owners that are able to make decisions and work together as a community. And what we did is we put all that into this GIS mapping, and we ended up with these big exclusion zones. And I think the proof was in the pudding, because then we started engaging with communities in each one of those areas. I think that if you were starting out, and again, our business right now is low-level radioactive waste, but if government did decide to go out and try to create that trust in those relationships, I would argue that some private company would probably be better off taking the lead on that. And the reason why is because I think it's really difficult to have the agility to build trust with community when you're government and you have large policy considerations that take time to change. Best example I can give to that is the most recent approval we've received from traditional owners to dispose of low-level radioactive waste is at our pending project in the Northern Territory, It's called Chandler. It's a deep geological repository about 800 meters under the ground. It's an underground salt sea the size of a small city. It's this crazy project in one of the most remote indigenous communities in Australia. And working with the Tchikala native title community, there was obviously real concerns and a real strong anti-low-level radioactive waste and nuclear movement in the Northern Territory. But one of the biggest things that changed to create a trust is, number one, our management team, we do the community engagement ourselves, right? And we did all this research for the last 12 years to develop this certain site in a certain area with the Tchikala, okay? And we were sitting there, and there was probably 80 people in the room, and we couldn't quite understand why there was so much pushback about the location. And we started to realize that actually there was a sacred place where we wanted to develop this site. So what we did is we said, look, we've given you a veto. If you don't want this project, we're going to walk away. So we'll just move it. And their jaws dropped, right? Because this is going to cost us hundreds of millions of dollars and years. But the fact of the matter is that to be able to make that decision on the spot and say, if you're not happy, if you don't want it on your land, there's no way it's ever going to happen. I just question whether government's going to be able to make that connections, because there's more processes involved and more policy that stands in the way. Trust, it's like a marriage or a friendship, right? You have to be able to make give and takes on the spot. And again, like I said, it's more art and science, but that's why I've been so proud of what we've done.
Thank you. And you mentioned before the experience in Osborne. So if you apply those lessons in your experience, best practice, what happened in Osborne there?
I mean, to me, it's like watching, and again, I'm sorry if this sounds offensive. It's like watching this same car crash all over again, right? Because what's been clear with every siting opportunity we've taken in this country, and we've tried to talk to certain entities about this, is you have to create trust first, bring people on the journey, and then announce. Same thing with Osborne happened, and in fact, there's been public statements by certain people in government saying it's going to happen no matter what, right? So if you go out and you announce this is what's going to happen, and then you engage, it's like telling your kids you got to go eat, you're going to eat those green beans, and now I'm going to tell you why they're good. No, tell them why they're good first, and then you have to build the trust first. And so to me, that well is already poisoned. Now the fact of the matter is you can go out, and I think recent legislation was passed where they'll be able to compulsorily push it through. But frankly, in a free and democratic society, like, you want to build the trust first and bring people along on the journey. And that's what's caused failures in the United States. Here, Germany, France, the UK, almost every Western democracy, there's been challenges because governments keep doing the same thing. Announce and then go out and create that relationship on waste. I think it needs to be reversed.
Thank you.
Thank you, Deputy Chair. Mr. Burnell.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Mr. Smith, for your evidence today. I just want to go back to this discussion about engagement with First Nations people. So, so you gave them the right for veto. Is that for the Chandler site or for Sandy Ridge as well?
Well, so Sandy Ridge predates, and we have one of our chief operating officer who led most of the community engagement at the very start there. That was a pretty open discussion about, from my understanding, about do we want it, right? But so, for example, two examples. Number one, with the Marlin-Gully people, which are our current traditional owners at Sandy Ridge, which is operational, we recently went through a process to triple our license capacity from 100,000 tons a year up to 280,000 tons a year. Again, this is your land. That's always what we start with. And there was a conversation about, do they want it? So they always have effective veto rights. So you never go through a point where you would end up suing our clients. It's a recipe for, nobody ever goes to a divorce lawyer and then gets back together, right? And yeah, so at Chandler, when we started from scratch, the very first thing we did is, I remember, Steve, you'll remember this as well, right? We sat down and they said, so you're telling us that if we don't want this project, you're going to walk away? And we said, of course we are. It's your land, right? And then that really took the heat out of the room when you start with a discussion, right? It takes additional time. That stuff's hard. But yes, it always has to start with, it's your land, it's a community's right. But I will say one thing there, right, is this isn't magic. There is nothing, whether it's, do you like dark chocolate or white chocolate, where you're going to get 100% consent, ever, right? And so I think the thing is bringing people along on the journey and then making the weight of community acceptance move forward. And look, I think that's the right way to handle it.
So just on that, so how long did it take you just to garner that level of like community endorsement, essentially? Like,
So Sandy Ridge, which is the operational facility here in Western Australia, it was around 8 years, 8 years, and in Chandler, it was about, I think we're almost at 13 years.
Right.
So, and there were some failures and coming back and moving, and I think, but a great example of how trust, trust begets trust, right? Is when we got Sandy Ridge up and running, when we went to the Malanguli people and talked about this deep borehole demonstration project, which by the way has never been approved anywhere in the world because of community issues, like they approved it right away because they said, look, you've always done what you said you were going to do. You've proved that you've operated this facility safely for 3 years, and that one happened in a matter of 3 months.
It's impressive.
Thank you.
And I say that in the sense that you've got the fortitude to say up front you've got right of veto, because it must not be easy as a commercial decision to put everything on the line to do that. But clearly, you've managed to do what we've been trying to solve for 50 years, essentially, the waste storage problem in this country, and you've managed to do it on 2 sites, well, nearly 2 sites here in Australia already.
I can't tell you how much that means. Yeah, just that acknowledgement, because we've always said, and this gets pandered around way too much, but you got to start with values, and that was one of the things that we wanted. We wanted to build trust, and so thank you.
So, and I think that this segues into the next issue, and that is, like, how do you translate that success around nuclear waste storage, albeit low level, but transitioning that conversation around social license into the actual nuclear discussion, power generation, with the set of markers that have already been put down by the opposition with their proposals nearly 7 months ago, has that stepped off on the right foot? Has there been enough follow-up to essentially ensure that when or if they were to come into government and enact their plan or policy, that they've got a level of success behind it?
I think it's a great question.
Is patience?
Well, I understand.
Absolutely.
I think it's a great question. I understand the parallel there. I guess what I have to say is the challenge with waste, and I'm always trying to explain this to our shareholders. We're trying to sell something nobody wants to spend money on and nobody wants, right? It's a cost center and it's something that nobody wants to talk about, right? So I think, to me, that's why the upfront discussion is so important. I frankly can't talk to something like power generation, where you're talking about jobs and other types of, that is a product that actually adds other ancillary value that society sees as quote good. So I'd be hesitant to copy and paste all of our experiences from waste to something that is potentially productive, but certainly there could be parallels drawn. And apologies, that's just not the power industry is not necessarily my experience.
But to gain that social license, it sounds like there was a high level of patience involved in getting to that end result where you had community supportive of the proposal.
I think
you're talking.
I think that's correct.
You said 8 and 12 years, nearly 13 years respectively. So you didn't rush the process of consultation just to get to your commercial goal. You made sure that you'd bedded in community support properly.
And we made that decision for us that was absolutely the right approach.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Burnell. And thank you for coming in, Mr. Smith. We've met quite a few times, and you know my opinion on what you've done already, so I don't need to go on about that. But what is the difference between your facility being a low-level facility and a high-level facility that would be needed for waste from a nuclear power station? What is the difference?
So what we've created is what's called a near-surface geological repository. So most of you guys are probably familiar with mining. Think about an open-cut mine that actually, can I step back for a moment? Because I want to make sure this is clear. So landfill, open-cut mine that has a liner. Mm-hmm. It's filled with waste. Water goes through it. You end up with leachate in the bottom. Every single landfill liner breaks, and you end up with groundwater pollution. Okay, this is why you have issues with PFAS, etc. What we've done is totally different. The concept of a geological repository is there's no liner. Instead, the natural barriers provide the protections because the natural barriers don't break. So what we are is a near-surface repository. It's an open-cut mine where we excavate about 30 meters down into a deep kaolin clay bed, and there's granite underneath it. And what we do is we emplace waste in layers, almost like a cake. We compact it, we have a seal, and it sits throughout geological time. That can take low-level radioactive material, and in some cases in the United States, they're considering taking intermediate material in those types of facilities. To take high-level radioactive waste, you instead have to have a deep geological repository, not an open-cut mine, but you have to burrow several hundred meters down into the earth, typically in salt or some hard rock like granite. And there you dispose of it deeper underground. Because of the type of radionuclides, you need additional safety, so that's why you go deeper.
Thank you. And so you've got the approval to go deeper for a test facility, is that correct?
So there's
high level?
two different ways that theoretically have been considered internationally to dispose of high-level waste. The first is what I described as a deep geological repository, which is to take larger volumes of waste. And that's what, for example, the committee has heard is being constructed in Finland, or that's the waste mobilization pilot plant, the WIP plant in the United States. Those are for larger volumes. That we have approval to build, but only for low-level radioactive waste and chemical waste in the Northern Territory with Chandler. The other potential, and this has really been talked about for countries with smaller volumes of radioactive waste, or for example, to create on-site high-level waste solutions for SMRs, there's been something called deep borehole. That concept is you create a smaller hole 4 to 5 kilometers underground, and you dispose of smaller amounts of waste. It would be less expensive, but the challenge has always been internationally. It was really proposed by our own CSIRO, which is pretty exciting, and then taken up by the US. But in order to prove out that technology, you needed a demonstration place to actually put down benign canisters and see how they react. No one had ever been able to get that approval. We talked to people at the IEA. We said we'd go talk to the Marlinguli people, and that's the approval that we've received. We can go dig, I believe, between 5 and 7 boreholes tomorrow if the Australian government or another government wanted to sponsor that. But those we have both of those projects approved, but one is for benign waste, it's a demonstration, and the other is just for low-level radioactive material.
And how long do you have to hold the low-level radioactive material for in your facility?
Right now, our institutional control period, which is how long it has to be actively and passively monitored, is 100 years.
Yep.
And at that point, it's considered by all the modeling and background and work with the regulator, including the peer-reviewed safety case by our PANZA, et cetera. That's long enough as 100 years. Quite a few other facilities international do 200, but because of the waste we're taking, we did 100.
And this is a strange question. I don't want to go into all the financial side of things, but how do you work out the cost over the period of time? Like we've been told by some experts through this that the high-level waste will last for thousands of years. How do you work out a cost?
Painfully. So the way that we did it for the way that we did it for low-level radioactive waste is we essentially had this pretty complex model. Remember, I said we cash funded this trust structure, and what we did is we talked about every plausible and implausible scenario that could happen to our site, everything from going bankrupt, which I don't ever expect us to happen if shareholders are listening, but also crashing a 747 into an open pit of low-level radioactive waste. There had to be enough money in there to clean it up. We then added escalators year on year, and then we added another like 40% contingency, and that's how we got to our number that needed to be in the trust structure. We would undergo a similar modeling exercise. For example, if we consulted or we did similar work on a high-level facility for government, you go through that same process, figure out what type of wastes, figure out all the potential things that could go bad, both plausible and implausible, and then make sure you have enough backing in the background to make sure that taxpayers are never left holding the bag.
Any chance you could tell us how much you think that would be?
No, because what's very important, and I'm not dodging the question, but what's really crucial there is, again, are we talking SMRs? What size, location?
You don't have the information you need.
A lot of detail,
Yeah,
that's right.
Fair enough. Excellent. Well, that is it. Thank you very much for coming in.